The studio lights blazed down on Jimmy Kimmel as he stood before his cheering audience, his grin sharp and predatory. The crowd roared, feeding off his energy, but tonight felt different, electric with an edge of malice. Jimmy adjusted his tie, leaned into the microphone, and launched into his opening monologue with a venomous bite. "Folks, we've got a big show tonight, but let's talk about our first guest, the guy who thinks he's the king of the universe, Elon Musk." The audience laughed, but Jimmy's eyes glinted with something darker. This man's out here building rockets to Mars, like Earth's not good enough for him. Who does he think he is, telling us we need to ditch our planet? I mean, come on, Elon. Maybe fix the traffic in Los Angeles before you start colonizing. Space! The crowd erupted, but the laughter carried a nervous undercurrent, sensing Jimmy's words were more than just jokes. Backstage, Elon Musk stood in the shadows, his jaw tight, hands clenched into fists. He'd agreed to come on the show to discuss his latest space venture, a bold plan to send civilians to the moon. But Jimmy's cheap shots were already souring his mood. An assistant whispered, "You're on in 5. But Elon barely nodded. His eyes locked on the monitor showing Jimmy's smug face. Another jab came, sharper this time. "Elon's got all this money, right? Billions. And what's he doing? Playing astronaut while the rest of us are stuck in line at the grocery store. Maybe he should buy us all a car that doesn't break down instead of dreaming about stars." The audience howled, but Elon's patience snapped. He strode toward the stage, ignoring the assistant's protests, his face a mask of cold fury. The music swelled as Jimmy announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Elon Musk." The crowd clapped, but the applause faltered as Elon emerged, his presence commanding yet icy. He didn't smile, didn't wave, just locked eyes with Jimmy and sat down, his posture rigid. Jimmy, unfazed, leaned back in his chair, smirking. "Elon, welcome. So what's this I hear about you wanting to send regular folks to the moon? You think we're all dying to live in a tin can up there?" The audience chuckled, but Elon's voice cut through like a blade. "Jimmy, maybe if you spent less time mocking progress and more time understanding it, you'd see why it matters." The crowd gasped, the air in the studio thickening with tension. Jimmy's smile vanished, replaced by a scowl. "Oh, progress? That's what you call it? Sounds like a rich guy's fantasy to me. You're out here acting like you're saving humanity, but all I see is a guy who loves the sound of his own voice." Elon leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "And all I see is a comedian who's too scared to think beyond his little studio." "You make fun of what you don't understand, Jimmy." "It's pathetic," the audience murmured, some cheering, others stunned, as the two men glared at each other. Jimmy slammed his hand on the desk, his voice rising. "Pathetic? You're the one selling pipe dreams to people who can't afford your cars. You think you're better than us, don't you?" Elon's laugh was harsh, cutting. "I think I'm trying to do something that matters, unlike you, hiding behind your jokes." The crowd was on edge, their cheers now mixed with uneasy whispers, as the argument spiraled. Jimmy's face reddened, his voice dripping with contempt. "You know what, Elon? People like you, with your big ideas, you don't care about regular folks. You're just chasing glory." Elon shot back, his words like ice. "And you, Jimmy? You're just chasing laughs, tearing down anyone who dares to dream bigger than your tiny world." The studio felt like a powder keg, the tension so thick it was suffocating. Jimmy's eyes flashed with rage, and he leaned closer, his voice low, but venomous. "You don't get to come on my show and talk to me like that." Elon didn't flinch, his gaze unwavering. "Then maybe you shouldn't have invited me." The studio air crackled with hostility as Jimmy Kimmel and Elon Musk stared each other down, their words still echoing in the stunned silence. The audience, caught between excitement and unease, shifted in their seats, their murmurs growing louder. Jimmy, his face twisted with anger, gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles white. He wasn't about to let Elon's last jab slide. "You think you can waltz in here, Elon, and act like you own the place?" he snapped, his voice sharp enough to cut glass. "This is my show, and I don't need some self-important billionaire telling me how to do my job." The crowd roared, some clapping for Jimmy's defiance, others egging on the fight, their cheers fueling the chaos. Elon's expression didn't waver, his eyes like steel as he leaned back in his chair, exuding a calm that only inflamed Jimmy further. "Your show?" Elon said, his tone mocking, each word deliberate. "All you do is tear people down to make yourself feel big." "You're not a host, Jimmy. You're a bully with a microphone." The audience gasped, a few shouting in protest, but others cheered, drawn to Elon's fearless bite. Jimmy's jaw dropped for a split second before his fury surged back, his voice booming. "A bully? That's rich coming from you. You run your companies like a dictator, firing anyone who dares disagree with your grand visions. You're no hero, Elon. You're a tyrant." The accusation landed like a punch, and the crowd's noise swelled, a mix of boos and wild applause. Elon's calm cracked, his face darkening as he leaned forward, his voice low but venomous. "You want to talk about leadership, Jimmy? At least I build something real. You just sit here, night after night, spitting insults to keep your audience clapping like trained seals." He gestured at the crowd, who erupted in a mix of outrage and excitement, some yelling support for Jimmy, others chanting Elon's name. The studio was a battlefield, and neither man was backing down. Jimmy's eyes blazed as he shot to his feet, pointing a finger at Elon. "Don't you dare talk about my audience like that. These people come here for a good time, not to hear you. Lecture them about your space fantasies." His voice shook with rage, but there was a flicker of desperation, as if Elon's words had hit a nerve. Elon seized on it, his smile cold and cutting. "A good time? You mean a distraction. You keep them laughing so they don't notice you've got nothing real to say. You're terrified of anyone who challenges your little kingdom, aren't you?" The crowd's reaction was deafening, their cheers and jeers blending into a chaotic roar that threatened to drown out the argument. Jimmy paced behind his desk, his hands clenched, his voice rising to a shout. "Terrified? Of you? You're a joke. Elon, you think you're changing the world, but all you're doing is selling dreams you can't deliver. Your rockets crash, your cars break, and you still act like you're untouchable." The audience gasped at the low blow, but Elon didn't flinch. Instead, he stood, towering over the desk, his voice icy with contempt. "And you, Jimmy? You've never taken a risk in your life. You hide behind your desk, throwing stones at people. Who dare to try? You're not just a coward, you're a fraud." The word hung in the air, sharp and final, as the crowd exploded, some chanting for a fight, others stunned into silence. The stage manager off to the side waved frantically, signaling for a commercial break. But Jimmy ignored him, his face red with fury. "You think you can call me a fraud on my own stage?" he bellowed, stepping closer to Elon, their faces inches apart. "You're the one who's full of it, promising the moon while your workers beg for a decent wage." Elon's eyes narrowed, his voice a dangerous whisper. "Keep talking, Jimmy. You're only proving how small you are." The audience was on its feet, the noise overwhelming as the two men stood locked in their standoff, the air thick with the promise of something explosive. The studio was a cauldron of chaos, the audience's roars and jeers shaking the walls as Jimmy Kimmel and Elon Musk stood inches apart, their faces twisted with rage. Jimmy's chest heaved, his eyes burning with the sting of Elon's last insult, but he forced a tight smile, stepping back toward his desk. He wasn't done yet. He'd planned for this moment, a way to bury Elon and reclaim his stage. "You think you're so clever, don't you?" Jimmy snarled, his voice thick with scorn. "Well, let's show everyone what a genius you really are." He waved to the crew, and the giant screen behind him flickered to life, drawing the crowd's eyes. The audience hushed, sensing a new attack. The screen displayed a cartoonish skit, a mockery of Elon's space dreams. A bumbling animated Elon, with an oversized head and a goofy grin, tripped over rockets labeled Failure 1 and Failure 2, while a voiceover cackled, "Elon Musk, the man who crashes more than he flies." The crowd burst into laughter, some clapping wildly, but others shifted uncomfortably, sensing the cruelty. Jimmy turned to Elon, his grin vicious. "What do you think, Elon? Pretty accurate, right? Maybe stick to building cars that don't catch fire." The laughter grew louder, but Elon's face was stone, his eyes locked on the screen, his silence more menacing than any shout. As the skit ended with the cartoon Elon tumbling into a black hole, Jimmy leaned forward, his voice dripping with malice. "Come on, admit it. You're in over your head and everyone knows it." The audience cheered, but Elon slowly turned to face Jimmy, his expression cold, his voice a low growl. "That's your big move, Jimmy? A cheap cartoon? You're so desperate. To feel important, you'll stoop to anything." The crowd's laughter faltered, some gasping at Elon's defiance. Jimmy's smile wavered, but he doubled down, his voice rising. "Desperate? I'm just showing the world who you are. A fraud who can't handle the truth." Elon stepped forward, his presence commanding the stage, his words sharp and unrelenting. "The truth? Let's talk about you, Jimmy. You've been coasting on this show for years, recycling the same tired jokes, pretending you matter. You're not a comedian anymore. You're a relic, clinging to applause while the world moves on." The audience erupted, some booing Elon, others cheering his audacity, the studio splitting into factions. Jimmy's face paled, his hands trembling, but he forced a laugh, his voice shrill. "A relic? You're the one living in a fantasy, Elon. Your big ideas are just smoke and mirrors, and you know it." Elon's eyes flashed, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "Smoke and mirrors? I've built things that last, things that change lives. What have you built, Jimmy? A career out of mocking people braver than you'll ever be." The crowd was deafening, their shouts a mix of fury and awe. As Jimmy staggered back, his control slipping, he slammed his fist on the desk, his voice a scream. "Braver? You're a selfish jerk who doesn't care who gets hurt. Get off my stage, Elon. You're done here." The audience gasped, the air electric with shock, as Elon stood his ground, unflinching. Jimmy's eyes were wild, his breath ragged, as he pointed to the exit. "I said get out. Nobody talks to me like that on my show." The stage manager rushed forward, waving for security, but Elon raised a hand, his voice calm but searing. "You're kicking me out because you can't handle the truth, Jimmy. You're scared, and everyone sees it." The crowd was on its feet, some chanting Jimmy's name, others roaring for Elon, the studio a whirlwind of emotion. Jimmy's face twisted with humiliation, his voice cracking. "Security, now!" As guards appeared, Elon gave Jimmy one last look, his eyes filled with disdain, and turned toward the exit, the audience's noise following him like a storm. The studio vibrated with raw energy, the audience's shouts and cheers a tidal wave as Elon Musk stood at the edge of the stage, his back straight, his face etched with unyielding resolve. Security guards flanked him, their hands hovering, but Elon's calm authority held them at bay. Jimmy Kimmel, behind his desk, was a storm of fury and humiliation, his face flushed, his voice still echoing from his command to throw Elon out. The crowd was split, some roaring Jimmy's name in loyalty, others chanting for Elon, their voices clashing like thunder. The air was thick with the weight of the moment, every eye locked on the two men whose battle had turned the show into a spectacle. Elon turned to face the audience, his gaze steady, his voice rising above the chaos. "You can kick me off this stage, Jimmy, but you can't stop what's coming. People like you who mock and tear down, you're the ones who fade. I'm building a future, and no one's laughter can stop that." The words landed like a hammer, And the crowd erupted, some booing, but many more cheering, their applause swelling with admiration for Elon's defiance. Jimmy's eyes widened, his hands gripping the desk as he realized the audience was slipping away, drawn to Elon's unshakable conviction. Jimmy forced a laugh, but it was brittle, his voice shaking as he tried to claw back control. Future? You're selling fairy tales, Elon, and these people know it. Go back to your rockets and leave the real world to us. The audience's response was mixed, some clapping for Jimmy, but the energy had shifted, the room no longer his. Elon's lips curled into a faint, scornful smile as he took a step toward the exit, pausing to look back at Jimmy. The real world? You wouldn't know it if it hit you. Keep hiding behind your desk, Jimmy. It's all you've got. The crowd gasped, then roared, the sound a mix of shock and awe as Elon walked off, his head high, the guards trailing uselessly behind him. The stage lights seemed to dim as Elon disappeared into the wings, leaving Jimmy alone in the spotlight, his chest heaving, his face a mask of rage and defeat. He shuffled his papers, trying to steady his voice, but the audience's restlessness was palpable, their whispers and murmurs a judgment on his loss. "All right, folks, let's move on," Jimmy said, his tone forced, his smile strained. "We've got a great show left." But the crowd's applause was weak, their excitement spent on the clash they'd just witnessed. Some shouted Elon's name, others heckled Jimmy, their voices sharp with disappointment. Jimmy's eyes darted to the stage manager, who shrugged, helplessly, as the show teetered on the edge of collapse. Backstage, Elon strode through the corridors, his steps deliberate, his face calm but fierce. A few crew members stared, some whispering, others nodding in quiet respect. He didn't need their approval, but the weight of his words lingered, a victory carved in the silence he left behind. The audience's cheers for him echoed in his mind, a reminder that he'd faced Jimmy's venom and walked away stronger. Meanwhile, Jimmy stumbled through the rest of the segment, his jokes falling flat, his energy drained. The crowd's laughter was polite at best, their thoughts still on the man who'd turned the stage into a battlefield and emerged unbroken. As the show cut to commercial, Jimmy slumped in his chair, the applause barely reaching him. The audience filed out later, buzzing with what they'd seen, their conversations alive with Elon's fire and Jimmy's fall. The story spread, not of a comedian's triumph, but of a visionary who'd faced a giant and won, not with fists, but with words that cut deeper. Jimmy's stage was his no longer. It belonged to the man who dared to dream beyond it, and the world would remember.